We often think about new ideas spreading, like someone suddenly gets hit with inspiration, like a light bulb going off.
Right, right.
But what if the bigger story, like throughout history and different cultures, is actually about families, like whole families accepting new beliefs together?
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder how much our families and all those social connections really shape what we end up believing.
That's a huge question, and a lot of our sources for this deep dive really dig into that.
Yeah.
We're going to explore this idea of evangelizing to whole families, seeing how powerful that can be. We'll look at some historical examples, church growth around the world, and even how beliefs are shared in places like African tribes and Muslim communities.
Okay, so we've got some really interesting stuff lined up.
Yeah.
Think about missionary work in China back in the 1930s, what we've seen in Korea and Latin America, and how beliefs get passed on in societies that are structured so differently.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're into social dynamics or you love digging into historical patterns or you just get a kick out of those aha moments, and things click into place, this exploration of how beliefs take root in communities is going to give us some fresh perspectives.
For sure.
All right, let's jump right in with a fascinating case from Northwest China in the 1930s.
Okay, so this first one involves two European women who were incredibly dedicated to their missionary work. They had become fluent in Chinese, and they really focused on spreading the gospel in these villages for like a whole decade.
Wow, a decade. And after all that work, they did see a congregation start to form.
They did.
But here's something really striking about it. It was mainly women. The men of the villages, they were pretty much absent. Although their kids would sometimes go to Sunday school.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, and the missionaries themselves, they had their own take on why that was. They talked about this hardness of hearts among the men, and they also noticed that sometimes parents would be against their teenagers getting baptized. But when you look at the bigger picture of what society was like back then, another important factor comes into play.
Okay, I'm listening.
Our sources really emphasize that in rural China during that time, the family wasn't just one social unit, it was the fundamental building block of society. Confucian values place so much importance on family relationships, between fathers and sons, husbands and wives, older and younger siblings. It was like the bedrock of their entire social order.
Right, that makes sense.
So it's worth thinking about how the missionaries' approach might have been seen in that context.
Yeah.
For instance, them being single women, that probably raised some eyebrows.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Why weren't they married? Where were their own families? In a society where your family line and connections were so crucial, these would have been big questions for the villagers. And then their focus on individual women, while it might have connected with them on a personal level, could have been seen by the community as kind of suspicious, maybe even like they were disrupting the social norms.
Right.
The unspoken worry might have been, why are these outsiders who aren't even related to us focusing on our women, potentially messing with our family structure? It got to the point where they were actually called family breakers when they encouraged women or young people to adopt this new faith without the whole family being on board.
Wow, that's intense. So a big takeaway here seems to be that individual efforts, even when they come from a good place, might run into some serious cultural roadblocks in societies where family unity is everything. Would you say that's a fair assessment based on what our sources say?
Oh, absolutely. That's the key point. And it leads us to think about this. How differently might things have gone if they had focused on the family from the beginning? Our second case study offers a really interesting contrast to that.
Yeah, it really does. So around the same time in 1930, the Little Flock Assembly in Shifu Shentong, they went through this period of spiritual awakening. And their response to that was pretty remarkable.
It was.
The members actually sold their possessions to support sending out 70 families, whole households. It was like sending out ready-made congregations to Northwest China, the same region where those two single women were working. They also sent 30 families to the Northeast.
Wow.
Yeah, and the results were significantly different. By 1944, just 14 years later, 40 new assemblies had sprung up. What's important to note here is that these weren't just people passively accepting new beliefs, they were actively sharing their faith with others too.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. That's a huge contrast compared to that first case, especially when you considered that both groups were equally dedicated and shared the same core beliefs.
Right.
So what was the key difference that led to such different outcomes?
Well, the main difference, as our source points out, was that the Little Flock Assembly sent out recognizable social units, families. They weren't seen as these isolated individuals, but as parts of the social fabric that people were already used to.
So instead of being outsiders, they were seen as people who could fit in.
Exactly. Think about it this way. The fathers in these families, they could naturally connect with the village elders. They shared that understanding of authority and responsibility. Grandmothers could build relationships with the older women, sharing their experiences and offering support. Housewives could invite their neighbors over to their homes, hosted by people who, in many ways, were just like them.
Right. It made it easier for them to connect on different levels within the community.
Exactly. It facilitated this natural integration and communication across the board.
It seems like this difference in China really highlights the power of going in with family units. Would you say that?
Oh, absolutely. And our sources suggest that this isn't just a China thing. This pattern pops up in different cultures.
Well, okay, interesting. So let's look at Korea, for example.
Okay, so in Korea, Roy Schurer, he observed that even today, Korean society is deeply rooted in family structures. And he noticed that the most effective way for someone to convert to Christianity was often within their own family network.
So it wasn't about convincing individuals to go against their families. It was about engaging the entire social unit.
Right.
What's interesting is the role that the heads of families played. Shearer talks about these men who had converted, and then they'd go back to their ancestral villages and successfully convince their relatives and even their extended family to adopt the new faith, too.
Wow.
He even uses this powerful image. He says that family relationships are like the transmission line for the current of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, that's a good one.
It really emphasizes how interconnected everything is. So what other examples from the sources show this strong family influence?
Well, our source points to India, specifically within the context of Hinduism. B.V. Subama argued that the Hindu family might be the only effective way to transmit and receive the gospel, while acknowledging that there are exceptions, in more individualistic settings like university campuses. But generally, she emphasizes this strong family influence.
Yeah, that makes sense when you think about how close-knit and interconnected a lot of traditional Hindu families are. Personal decisions, especially about religion, often have huge implications for the entire family unit.
For sure.
Okay, so then we have Latin America. Our source highlights Chilean Pentecostal communities. And similar to the Little Flock Assembly, they deliberately send out families to grow their church. This tactic uses the strong family bonds that are typical in the Roman Catholic culture down there.
It's interesting how they tap into those existing cultural norms.
Right. It seems like this approach of sending out whole families is a big reason why Pentecostalism has seen such phenomenal growth across Latin America.
Yeah, by becoming a part of the existing social networks and showing their faith through their family life, they're really connecting with the culture of these communities. It's like they're speaking the same language.
Yeah, exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at what our source calls face-to-face societies, especially in African tribal communities. Their whole understanding of identity can be pretty different from our individualistic Western views.
Oh, yeah. In a lot of these societies, identity isn't about what you think as an individual, I think, therefore I am, but more about your participation. I participate, therefore I am.
Interesting. So it's less about your personal thoughts and more about being part of the group.
Exactly. Being involved in the traditional religious rituals and customs is a huge part of how people see themselves and where they fit in the community.
So if someone in that kind of community converted to a new religion all on their own, it could have serious consequences. They could be seen as betraying their community and end up being ostracized.
Yeah, that's a powerful example of how important collective decisions are when it comes to religious changes in these societies.
Okay, so that brings us to Muslim families and communities. Our source emphasizes that when people try to share their beliefs with Muslims individually, it often doesn't work very well. There's this interesting observation from a lecturer at the University of Singapore who said that for most Malay students who are mainly Muslim, Islam isn't just a personal faith. It's deeply connected to their sense of community.
Oh, I can see that.
So it's not just about changing an individual's beliefs. It's about understanding and engaging with those strong social and cultural ties.
Right.
The source talks about people movements, where whole groups or communities decide to shift their religious allegiance together.
And often that involves working with community elders and leaders.
Exactly. There's a great example in Indonesia where missionaries and local religious leaders actually started a dialogue with Muslim community leaders.
Oh, wow.
And it led to whole communities going through religious instruction and being baptized.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and historically we see this with figures like Kotab Yu in Burma, who played a big role in the conversion of entire Karen communities.
So across all these different cultures and time periods, there's this recurring pattern. The family and the wider community are powerful forces when it comes to passing on and accepting new beliefs.
It really makes you rethink that individualistic way of looking at how ideas spread.
For sure.
And it's amazing how this lines up with a biblical perspective, too. Our source reminds us that the family is something God created. It's described in Ephesians as the foundation for every family in heaven and on earth.
And the church itself is often described using family terms like the household of God and the household of faith. The Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, puts a lot of emphasis on marriage, parent-child relationships, the whole structure of family life. And the New Testament builds on those themes.
Right. We have Joshua's powerful declaration, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the Passover feast, which is a central event in Jewish history. It was a family meal where they passed down the story of their liberation through generations. So the family was both receiving God's saving acts and the means of passing them on.
And the way the early church functioned seems to reflect that focus on households. The book of Acts mentions teaching happening within families. We see entire households converting to Christianity, like Cornelius Lydia and the Philippian jailer, and those first fruits families of Stephanus Crispus and Gaius.
And those households didn't just become believers, they became centers for spreading their faith. Think about Aquila and Priscilla's home in Rome and Ephesus, or the gatherings in the homes of Onesiphorus and Nympha. It's clear that the early church recognized and used the power of family and households to share their message.
That's a good point.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway seems pretty clear. The way beliefs spread is fundamentally connected to social and family structures. While individuals can definitely have their own conversions, the influence of these collective and family movements on how religious and cultural landscapes change is huge. Understanding these dynamics gives us a much deeper understanding of how ideas take hold and spread within communities.
And for our listeners who are all about getting knowledge quickly and effectively recognizing these patterns, can help them understand those cultural shifts and how ideas are transmitted in all sorts of contexts, even in today's world. It encourages us to look beyond individual choices and see the power of our social connections.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought to chew on. In our societies that are becoming more and more individualistic, what are the modern equivalents of these family-based movements? How can understanding these historical examples help us connect with others and share ideas within our own networks and communities? What does this tell us about the lasting power of shared identity and belonging in shaping what we believe? That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, great question to leave on.
Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.